Let's now go into Visual Studio and actually try out some of these skills and look at some of the windows and files that we talked about. So we're just kind of give a small tour of Visual Studio. So we first talked about creating a project. Now we did this in the last lecture with the Hello World program, but let's just do it again for review purposes. So we'll click on New Project to create a new project. And then we have our template set for Visual Basic. We have our different options here. For what we'll be doing in this class, we will always be doing the Windows Forms application. You can try out any of the others that you want. You're more than welcome to on your own, but all the examples for what we'll be doing here will be under Windows Forms application. We then need to give a name for this project. I'm just going to call this test project. Since we're just testing the project, we're not doing anything special with it. And then we can go choose our location. So we can click on browse. And right now, let's see here. Let's back up just a little bit. So we see that we're under users, Emily65 documents. Let's go into Visual Studio 2013. We'll put it in the projects folder. That makes sense, right? So we'll click on select folder. And then our solution name will be the same as our project name. That's fine. And there really isn't anything else we need to do here. So we'll just click OK. And then in just a second, there it is. We have our project. Now we also mentioned about debugging the project. And what this basically means is we can execute the program. And as long as everything compiled correctly, it will run. It actually compiles the code automatically and then runs it as long as everything worked. Now if there's a problem, an error message will pop up to say there was a problem here. Then you can actually see the line that caused the compile error. But to actually execute the program, there are two ways we can do it. One way is the approach that we did with our Hello World program, which was to click on Start right here. There it is. It does nothing. It's just a blank form, but that's fine. It shows that it does run. The other approach is right above Start, you'll see the word Debug. If you click on that, that gives you a menu, and there are two options we look at for running the program here. Either Start with Debugging or Start without Debugging. Either one is fine. They'll both run the program. The difference between the two is that what we can do in our code is include what are called breakpoints, which means if we start with debugging, we'll actually pause the program in the middle of its execution at the line of where we added the breakpoint. And this is great where if we know there's a problem with our code, we want to debug it by looking at what happens when we run one line at a time. So there are other options in here, such as step into, step over, which allow us to go to the next instruction in several different ways. We're not going to actually do any debugging in this class, but you may find it useful if you encounter any problems with your programs. The next thing we'll take a look at is how we would save the project. And this is done at the File menu, which is at the far left side. So we click on File, and we see that we can save the current form that we're at, or we can click on Save All. I just prefer Save All, just to make sure that everything is saved. You can also do Control S on your keyboard. That also saves the entire thing. One thing I should mention is that anytime that you execute the program, it's automatically saved beforehand. It has to be saved before it can be compiled. And then if you want to quit everything without debugging anything, you do have to save. So if you make some changes and then you try to quit, it's going to ask you to save stuff. Now let's go ahead and close the project just to show how we can do that. And we're going to close it without closing Visual Studio. This is pretty straightforward. If we go to File, and then we go down to Close Solution, that will close the entire project. So project's gone, Visual Studio is still up. It's pretty straightforward. So we've closed the project. Maybe we want to reopen the project. Well, to do that, we'll go back to the File menu, and then we'll click on Open. And over here, you should see the option says Project/Solution. So we'll click on that. And then now we can go to the directory of where our solution file is located. So we'll go to Computer. We'll go to C drive. Then it's under Users. Now, I should mention that where this is could be different depending on where you created your project, but this is where I saved it on here. So it may be just a different place if you saved your project somewhere else. So we'll go to My User, and then My Documents. Visual Studio 2013, projects, and there we go. There's test project, so we can click on that. And then this file right here, this is what's called the solution file or the .sln file. If we open that up, that will open up Visual Studio. We can even go into this file outside of Visual Studio, and if we were to double click on it, it would actually open up Visual Studio. So you don't have to have Visual Studio open to actually open this file, but we'll do it anyway. So we'll click on open, and there's our project again. Now let me show you how we would find this outside of Visual Studio, because there's at least one thing there that I think you'll find useful. So I have the File Explorer open up here, and let me just go back to the beginning, just so that way you know how to get there. So we can go to the same location in our File Explorer. Once again, I'll reiterate that this could be located somewhere else on your computer, depending on where you have saved your files. So under users, my documents, Visual Studio 2013, projects, then test project. So here's that solution file that we talked about before, but let's take a look at what's inside this folder here. Now we see that we have the Visual Basic files for our form and the design view of the form. So we could open those up if we wanted to. We're not going to really mess with any major files in here unless we're doing it through Visual Studio. But I do want to show you the bin folder. Bin folder is short for binary, which means it contains executables. And in particular, we have the executable for our actual project. So if I double click on this, it executes our program. So what's nice about this is we don't have to run our program through Visual Studio. We usually do that, but if we want to execute it outside of Visual Studio, we can just double click on the executable and it takes care of it just like that. So I can double click again. There is our project. Now, granted, it doesn't do anything, but it is a working and running program on our computer. And I think we mentioned that we could, if we wanted to, transfer this to another location. So the way we would do that, my recommendation is, first of all, make sure you close everything in Visual Studio, and then we could just cut the entire project. We have to do the entire folder here and then put it somewhere else, and then we can reopen it. We're not going to worry too much about that here, but I'll just mention that we can do that. So that takes care of mostly the basic skills, but let's look at some of the windows that we have available inside of Visual Studio. So we've already mentioned that the first window that pops up, this tab right here, is the design view of our form. So that's why it says form1.vb, and then we have in square braces or square brackets the word design. So this is where we could insert text boxes, buttons, radio buttons, labels. We'll be doing all that stuff in this course. But we can actually specify where we want to put it. So it's kind of a, how do we visualize this program? Another reason why this whole program here is called Visual Studio, but we can actually see where things are going to go on our form, which is really convenient because beforehand we didn't have that feature. You had to specify the actual coordinates with code, which would have been a huge pain here. Now we can access some of the views using our view menu. So we can click on code, and that allows us to view the code for this particular form. We can also click on designer, and that also will show the form. So not only can we double click on the form to view the code form and take a look at this, but we can use the view menu to actually look at different options. So if we want to look at the code of the file or the designer option of it, either one is perfectly fine. Now we'll mention also the form1.vb file. I mean, this whole thing right here is the form1.vb file, which we can see over here in our Solution Explorer. So let's see what happens if we take a look in here. Not too much, so we're not going to do too much here, but there are some properties below here, and we'll be talking more about these properties later on. So there are some different categories, some different properties with it. If I were to click on the form itself, we can see we have some different things like font, color. Let's see here, we got behavior stuff, data, design. Those are different categories, but they have things like the name of the form. We have auto scroll features, locations. So we have all sorts of properties in this window down here. This is going to be very useful, especially when we start adding tools like buttons and labels where we need to adjust some of the properties, but we can always find that in this section right here. And then up here, the Solution Explorer, which we kind of played around with a little bit, would contain all the files and resources that would be part of the project. So right now, the only thing that's in the project is this form1.vb, which if we were to double click, it would show up on here. But as we add more files or more resources to the project, they would be they would show up in the Solution Explorer, so we can click on it to actually see everything that we would need to actually run our program and make changes to it. And then the last thing we'll mention is the toolbox option right here. We'll be using this a lot on the left side. If we click on this tab, a new window appears, and this contains all the different tools that we can include in our form. Now, this right here says all Windows forms, but we can look at different categories such as containers, common controls, components, dialogues, all sorts of things. I usually prefer all Windows forms. That way we just see everything in here. And we'll go through here and see all sorts of stuff like checkboxes, buttons, event logs, what's we here, labels, list boxes, all sorts of things. Notify icons, calendars, panels, picture boxes, progress bars, text boxes, timers. I mean, there's all sorts of tools in here. And then we can just select the tools and add them to our program over here. Oh, let's put that back over there. But yeah, that's pretty much the basics of Visual Studio.